Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It's race week for the US Grand Prix in Texas. This time last year, Ferrari scored a 1-2 around this track. This year, that is expected to be a very different story indeed. Major new developments today. Rumours emerging that Ferrari are under serious trouble with the FIA based on pushing their car right to the absolute limit in terms of the grey areas of these regulations and prioritising that over actually making a good car. Hamilton and Leclerc are giving their suggestions behind the scenes, and Hamilton is frustrated and constantly running into political issues that are affecting things internally at Ferrari. What next? Can Vasseur survive this chaos over the last few weeks and the disintegration of the Ferrari title challenge this year, if it even got underway at all? Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Plenty to get into. We're going to start here. The US Grand Prix in Austin, Texas. Haas, you know, they like to say they're an American team. They kind of are, right? But obviously, Andretti coming in kind of as Cadillac, that will take over the crown next year. So I guess Haas have to make the most of it while they can. They've got a special livery. I mean, is it really that special? I don't know. Like, this is probably a better angle of what they're cooking up for the weekends. It's red, it's black, it's white, it's got some stars and stripes. So there you go, right? That's the Haas for this weekend. I'm not sure it's going to be massively turning heads. Maybe they can find a way to pick up a couple of points. We also have to talk about the tyre compounds this year. So last year, it was a C2, C3, C4. They've not gone a step softer this year. Instead, they've swapped the hardest tyre for a C1 instead of a C2. So look, you can probably still go for the one stop, but if you're going to go for the one stop, you're going to need to use the harder compounds being the C1, which is likely to be a significantly slower tyre. So this is another way that Pirelli can try and promote more stops, is they effectively make the harder compounds not as good, not as fast, because it still could be doable anyway, but at least now it should have less performance. Do Pirelli really know what they're doing with the tyres? I don't know about that one so much, but the teams might not be so happy with the C1. The C1 isn't very good most of the time anywhere, really. But in Austin, when it's super hot, it's a high degradation circuit a lot of the time. It makes sense maybe that the C1 could be a more viable option, could push us in a direction of a two-stop, especially if there's a safety car as well. Speaking of US Grand Prix circuits, of course, we used to race around Indianapolis back in, let's say, 2002 as one example. But this is Mick Schumacher in an Indy car. So just keeping up on what Mick Schumacher's up to. There was some talk about he could get a reserve driver spot at Cadillac. That never materialised. His most likely option this year is actually a move to IndyCar. There's been talk about this now for a bit of time. It looks like he wants to step away from sports car racing and the Endurance Championship and move over back to single-seaters again. It looks like IndyCar could be a good option. If this goes well with his test, it's likely he's going to get an offer there for next season. Now, speaking of these other motorsport series, there was a bit of drama about F2. Obviously not something we discussed too much on this channel, right? But Max Esterstone, in reply to Citrus F1 here, is talking a little bit about F2. So he says, first endurance race in the books, triple stint to start the race with a great car, strategy saw me go from 12th to 4th, few setbacks, etc, etc, did a solid job. Now, he had an F3 campaign, he had an F2 campaign, and Citrus says, the guy did a great job, quite shocking if you compare it to his F2 campaign. And he says in the replies, and look, whatever you want to say, I'm not going to pretend that I followed his F3, F2 campaign closely enough to give an accurate assessment on this. All I know is watching F2, you do have questions on whether the cars are truly equal, certainly whether the engines are truly equal, right? And I think it's kind of like a known thing that they try to sweep under the rug, that F2 is not as equal as it might want to appear, right? And I think this is kind of known, but it is nonetheless interesting, right? For example, last year, Prema used to dominate mostly the F2 series. Not dominate, but they'd usually have at least the best car. They'd be right up there. They'd change the regs slightly. And last year with Behrman and Antonelli, they weren't at the races, really. So this is an issue because everyone kind of implies that F2, well, all the cars are the same, so the real talents will rise to the top and then they can get selected for F1. That's not necessarily the case. That is true, of course, to a certain extent. The talented drivers will stand out. Maybe Esterson was just not particularly among them, but you don't usually get, whatever you think about this, you don't often get drivers saying this stuff out loud. The disparity between cars and engines in F2 affects performance more than most people probably know, which is why I no longer wanted to do it, he says. So it's something that, you know, if F1 are hearing this, if the FIA are hearing this, this should be sending alarm sirens ringing, but as I say, a lot of these things are kind of known but not massively talked about. A couple of other updates. You've got this guy who's been the lead mechanic for Max Verstappen for some time, Matt Corler. He's getting poached away by Audi at the end of this year. I think this was talked about and rumoured a while ago, but it's now been locked in, made official. So is it going to make a massive amount of difference to Red Bull and Max next year? Not necessarily, but it's certainly something worthwhile mentioning. All of the top teams struggle to keep staff over time. They get pinched away. This is a problem that McLaren are now facing in full force because their top guys are getting targeted at length by their rivals because they are now the team on top. When Red Bull were on top, their top guys were getting targeted. It was the same for Mercedes. It's always how it goes. So, and it's not like these guys are making so much money that they're easily able to refuse any possible offers, right? If some team comes along and offers you twice as much, you are going to take it more than likely, especially if you've worked with Max, you've won the championships with Max, and now it's available for a next adventure. So this is an issue that the teams deal with on all levels of Formula One, and even to a certain extent affecting the contract situation of George Russell. Don't want to discuss this in great length, but there was just a little bit more talk about next year. Max Verstappen believes Mercedes are going to have the best engine. Carlos Sainz believes Mercedes are going to have the best engine. He said that in an interview over the last few days, one of the key reasons that he joined Williams, and understandably so. Everyone expects Mercedes to be very competitive next year. McLaren, you would presume, would also be very competitive, but who knows? How will the Mercedes power unit integration go? Brand new power unit, brand new aero. That could cause some serious complications. Red Bull, their engine isn't really expected to be up to scratch. Ferrari are Ferrari, right? So, who knows what's going to happen there. Maybe it is their year finally. Maybe it's not, as we'll discuss in a second. Honda, as in Aston Martin, they could be a threat. But it seems very likely that Mercedes will at least be a championship contender, right? They might not run away with it, as some people fear, but it is very unlikely, I would say, that Mercedes aren't at least in the fight for next year's title. And that's why George Russell wants to stay, of course, which gives him slightly less leeway when it comes to negotiations, because Toto Wolff very much knows that George wants that Mercedes drive and he will get it. It's a matter of what the terms of that contract renewal are. But I guess the argument is the same is also true the other way around, right? Mercedes need a driver because Toto has apparently been under a lot of pressure in the ground effect era to get back to the top. His, colleagues, let's say, at the very top of Mercedes, they've seen Mercedes win for 8 consecutive years. On some level, you're expecting that to continue. And having not won for a few years and not really seemingly figuring out what it takes to get back to that point, Toto finds himself under pressure. That was why apparently Mercedes were willing to drop $100 million to buy Max Verstappen out of his contract now. That didn't happen for various reasons. But if that's what it takes to get Mercedes back to the top, that's what they want to do. So Mercedes need a driver of the quality that could win a championship. I firmly believe George is of that quality and mentality if the car was right. So, and all the other drivers are locked down, right? So I think from Russell's perspective, he probably realizes that actually maybe Mercedes need him as much as he needs Mercedes. Because can they rely on Antonelli delivering a title challenge even if next year's car is the best? Probably not yet, right? So that adds a little bit more colour to those negotiations. Actually, speaking of Mercedes, I did want to quickly share this clip. This is the front wing of the Mercedes W16 at the Singapore Grand Prix. And again, we can see, presumably we'll just focus mainly on the end of the straight here because this is from top speed to not top speed. And you can see the level of flexing here that wing is doing. Now, all the wings flex, but we know that they introduced a new front wing in Singapore, which gave that wing more flex than it previously had. But it's still within the regulations. So very clever from Mercedes, and this is kind of relevant because it might impact their performance in the coming rounds as well. But also it's very critical for Ferrari. This time last year, Ferrari were a contender. They won 2 in Austin. Sainz went on to win in Mexico shortly afterwards. They nearly won the Constructors' Championship. And as the Auto Racer guys point out, last year the flexibility, the flexi front wings, right, they were helping Ferrari to a certain degree. Now, Mercedes and Red Bull have continued to work on this technology despite the FIA trying to clamp down on it, Mercedes especially and Red Bull well to a certain extent as well. They've continued pushing and made gains as a result. Ferrari have given up on this year's car a very long time ago, but it also feels a very long time ago that Ferrari 1-2 happened in Austin last year, and feels impossible to imagine that it would happen again this time around. I mean, speaking of American interest in Charles Leclerc, for example, Mario Andretti made it very clear that in a heartbeat he would take Leclerc at Cadillac. I mean, obviously, but he's not going to go there. The point stands that other teams are interested in Charles Leclerc's services, as well they should be, and Leclerc may no longer be interested in putting up with all the drama at Ferrari and want to potentially sacrifice his whole career at a team which continues to fail to deliver for multiple reasons. And we'll get into exactly why. So there's been every day rumours as to what might be happening with Ferrari, especially because their season has really nosedived. At the start of the year, after they won the sprint in China, then yeah, Hamilton got disqualified for the next day, but it still felt like, you know, let's say Imola maybe, there was some decent performances in there that showed promise that maybe something could happen. But Spain happens, the flexi-wing directive comes in. Since then, and even despite the rear suspension changes they made, things have really just been in a negative death spiral, right? Every other team has surpassed them. They're struggling to, you know, finish better than P6, P7 at the moment. We've got Mercedes back on top. We've got Verstappen back on top. The McLaren's always ahead of Ferrari, whatever happens. They're fighting with Astons. They're fighting with Racing Bulls for the bottom end of the point. It's not a good place for Ferrari to be. And the question for many is, how did they go from starting this regulation cycle so promisingly to where they are today? So there were loads of articles about this. Again, I don't want to say it's coordinated because people want to talk about it, but pretty much every publication in Italy is talking about Ferrari today, something or another, about what's going on there behind the scenes. So this is what Formula Passion talk about. I'm not sure I fully agree with this assessment, but the argument is that with the engine in 2019 and what happened therefore in 2020, the flexi planks, right, the plank changes obviously that happened back in 2022, with the technical directive, the braking heat systems, of course the flexi wings last year and kind of into this year to a certain degree as well, there's a feeling that Ferrari are getting a lot of their performance by what you might call like cheap tricks, and every time the FIA closes those grey areas, their pace then collapses. And pretty much the argument is that a lot of their performance over the last few years has depended on concepts which are very borderline when it comes to the regulations. Now, look, if you're a good Formula One team, you are exploiting the grey areas. But fundamentally, you need a solid, sustainable foundation. So I do get the point from both sides. Maybe Ferrari have pushed the boundaries too much when it comes to these things, and when the grey areas are closed, they get exposed. But also, that is what you should do as a Formula One team, push the boundaries, right? So I don't think they've necessarily done that more than other teams. Maybe they've just been more reliant on it because their underlying concepts simply have not been as good. We also know that back in Singapore, there were rumours about a heated discussion between Fred Vasseur and Matteo Tognanali. Now, he's one of the top guys over there, and apparently he's, well, let's say he has his strong opinions. Now, there's some discussion as to what next here, because if Vasseur and Tognanali do not necessarily see eye to eye all the time, that raises questions. There have been too many errors in car setup, in adjustments, in race execution, which explains why Ferrari often starts out strong in free practice, benefiting from simulator-based setups, but when it comes to decisive decisions being made in the decisive sessions, they fade badly. Now, this is the individual in question. He's been around Ferrari for quite some time, but the rumour has it, known internally as Pluto, he's regarded as a demanding character, not always easy to work with, but a highly competent engineer. His strong opinions often lead to friction, but there is no question that he will remain in his post. But apparently some at the team have pointed fingers at this guy for being the source of all of the issues, as it were. And look, does he represent something which could be flawed with Ferrari? I can see the argument there. But I can also see the argument that, you guys remember when Inaki Rueda was in charge of strategy at Ferrari, they fired him. Has strategy got much better? Maybe, right? But it doesn't seem that it's not like there's a silver bullet here. You get rid of one guy and everything is resolved. It's clearly more complicated than that at Ferrari. There's also rumours, and this is where we come to kind of the Hamilton side of the discussion, as to the fact that the team is under pressure from the FIA. So we know that the FIA, the race finishes, they scrutinise some of the cars. But apparently, based on maybe what happened back in China and since then, the relationship with the FIA has become increasingly strained. Ferrari International Assistance, they once used to be known as. But apparently the SF25 is getting inspected more frequently, maybe than other teams, and maybe you think that's unfair, but also maybe it's justified if they keep finding things that are very much on the line. So apparently they're needing to use very conservative setups now, Ferrari, to not violate the rules. Maybe it's just a fundamental issue with this car. We know that the plank wear has been an issue for them. If they could run their car without caring about plank wear, they'd probably win the races, or at least they'd be far more competitive. But also that's true for the other teams as well. If you let McLaren run their car where they wanted to, they would probably also be faster. So that's a matter for debate, but apparently the FIA aren't very happy with Ferrari, and as a result, Ferrari are on the back foot because they have a load of grey area things, especially you'd imagine the plank wear, which is very much on the limit. We saw it back in Hungary, right, where Leclerc's pace disappeared off the planet after we think they raised the tyre pressures to protect the floor. That's just one of these examples. They brought the rear suspension. They thought that was going to solve the problem, but that's not what happened at all. Now, what's interesting about this is Mercedes and Red Bull have kept pushing, right, as have McLaren to a certain degree. But Ferrari, they cancelled a new floor plan for Baku. They decided not to invest any further resources into flexi-wing designs, which Red Bull and Mercedes, as we have seen over the last few minutes, that's what they have done. And that apparently surprised Ferrari. Despite this, they won't revert to its previous suspension layout as Mercedes did, which is interesting because they did have, when the car was maybe doing better, a different rear suspension. And actually, Mercedes did swap back and it benefited them. They realised that their changes weren't going the right way. Ferrari seemingly think that, well, it's probably fine. But apparently sources at Maranello say that Ferrari just don't understand flexi-wing technology as well as the other rivals. And as a result, they're falling behind. You know, they're not even attempting to circumvent the TD018 limits as the other teams have because they just don't have the know-how. Now, maybe this works next year. Maybe Ferrari save the power in terms of development resources and they hit 2026 really hard. But for now, it is compromising their performance for sure. Another article here from Motorsport Italia talking about there's a growing sense at Ferrari that things are very much divided. They're struggling to align on technical decisions. Apparently there's extreme setup choices preventing the SF25 from unlocking potential. There's the trackside engineers to which the balance of influences leans towards potentially including Tognanelli that we mentioned. But Loic Serra now, apparently, as the technical director, he will now have the forefront. So, again, it's just absolute abject chaos, isn't it? Like, what's happening behind the scenes at this team. And I think the Corriere article sums this up rather well. Let me just translate this to English. I'll leave the entire thing linked down below if you guys want to check it out. I'm not going to go through every single thing. I did just want to quickly delve into in a little bit more detail this quote, which comes as follows. Mercedes began working on this issue in terms of warming up the tyres from a car that wasn't up at the top to extract potential, seeking solutions such as introducing medium tyres and qualifying with good results. Lewis was also referring to this. So apparently Hamilton's like, look, guys, can we not... He actually did mention this, didn't he? He was like, guys, why aren't we using the mediums in qualifying? Why aren't we on tracks where there's a C5, right? So that, or the C6, so they can use a C5 medium instead. He expected, this is the damning quote, he expected to have more influence on the decisions, but instead found himself faced with a series of unheard requests and having to battle against internal politics to make improvements. Vettel had a similar experience. So it's very challenging for Hamilton right now, and like I imagine on some level he was kind of expecting this, but if it's true that there's a big issue internally at Ferrari, Hamilton has tried to push for changes to methodology, to procedure, apparently submitting that report, or that document that he gave to upper management, but as it stands, nothing is changing, and nothing is changing fast. So drew to your thoughts in the comments below. Hamilton frustrated, the team in trouble with the FIA, the team arriving to Austin probably knowing that any sort of success is likely to be totally out of the window. And if they want to push for it, then you can expect another disqualification like what's happened over the last couple of years here. Hamilton and Leclerc have both had that happen to them over the last couple of years around this track. So plank wear is going to be an issue around Austin. You can't imagine that's going to favour the Ferrari especially well. So very much interested in your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.